It's the week ending Saturday the 28th of August, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen over 80,000 people evacuated from Kabul airport following the Taliban takeover, the Paralympic Games beginning in Tokyo, and the death of Rolling Stones drummer Charlie Watts at the age of 80. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team, it is no less than the boss man, Holden Frith. Also from the Week Junior, editor Felicity, Capon, and queen of freelancers, and our emissary for suburban migration, Suchandrika Chakrabarti. What a panel. Holden, you're kicking us off today. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Just when you thought it was safe to go back into the forest.
The first thing I learned about Black Plague is that the symptoms are fucking horrifying. The most common form of the disease is known as bubonic plague, which is spread by fleas on rats. After an incubation period of 3 to 7 days, you experience sudden, violent flu symptoms. You develop smooth, painful lesions on your groin, armpits, and neck, which are known as buboes, the Black Plague's classic calling card. Then, internal bleeding turns your fingers and toes black, and you start vomiting blood. As the disease progresses, you lapse into constant seizures, confusion, and coma, and then you die in total mind-numbing agony.
Well, that's just what we all needed. The return of the bubonic plague, a video from Vice Impacts released to YouTube last year. Holden, the plague? Explain.
Yeah, sorry about that. I should say we in the recording have been subjected to visuals that go with that audio. So if you're just listening, consider yourself lucky. What happened this week was the first patients enrolled in a vaccine trial have received injections intended to protect them from bubonic plague, also known as the Black Plague, and probably most famously as the Black Death. This is the disease that killed between a third and a half of Europe's population in the 14th century. And although it can now be treated, it's still endemic in parts of America, Asia, and particularly Africa. There's usually about 1,000 to 2,000 recorded cases per year, according to the World Health Organization. They say there's likely to be at least that many again that go unreported. And while it is quite straightforward to treat with antibiotics, you do have to get that treatment quite quickly, and it can be hard to deliver those drugs in time to the kind of remote places where these outbreaks tend to happen.
Yeah. Felicity, topics like the plague are kind of classic Week Junior territory, aren't they, as kind of historical briefings? But did you realise it was still a current threat, the plague?
No, I didn't. And I felt slightly embarrassed that I hadn't realised that. I think I thought it was one of the ones that we had just... I mean, it was just so hideous and so horrific watching the videos. And then it was one of those topics on the internet where you go down a really dark and disturbing rabbit hole and you just remember how awful it was, how bad the death would have been, especially I think it's the not the bubonic version, but the one which affects your lungs, where you had
the pneumonic version.
Pneumonic, that's the one. You had like 24 hours, and it's just these agonising deaths, which are so awful. And I don't want to sound flippant, but it sort of puts COVID a bit in perspective. I mean, this was such a big killer. It was so bad. The effect on global populations was so extreme, and I was just amazed to discover that it's still in pockets of the world today. I mean, even in states in North America, I think there was a kid in Montana who had complications with the plague. And watching that Vice report in its entirety, which is so interesting because they sort of go to this extremely remote village in Madagascar where they're sort of speaking to people who survived it.
I think it's Madagascar.
That's so annoying. But it was even just getting this helicopter from the capital to this completely remote little village and meeting people who have survived, something that I thought that we were, in my sort of Western, totally complacent perspective, thought that we were sort of beyond this. It was just so eye-opening, and it was just horrifying, really.
Well, this is it, Suchandrika, isn't it? If you get it in the West, the chances are, as Holden alluded to, actually you will get the antibiotics. So the people that were getting it in Madagascar, and there was an outbreak that killed in 2017 upwards of 150 people there, and there's varying different estimates on exactly how many. Those people didn't get the antibiotics in time, but you sort of wonder, well, would they get the vaccine? Like, what's the point of developing a vaccine? Because, we're going to see the same thing as with COVID, aren't we? Isn't it going to be the rich countries that get the vaccine first?
Yeah, that seems about right, doesn't it? So we could look at how quickly the mRNA vaccine for COVID-19 was developed, because it never has been before. So until 2020, the vaccine that was developed the fastest was the mumps vaccine back in the 60s. And again, it's that kind of political pressure and social pressure of this is a very contagious disease that is affecting lots of people, and that tends to attract the funding that's needed to really push this development, make it happen really quickly. And just hearing from experts who are talking about the positive things about having this vaccine for lots of different illnesses, there is always the problem that there won't be the political pressure to get the money to make sure this happens in time. So if so few people in remote areas are affected, unfortunately, it doesn't seem likely that, for instance, the US, the UK would sort of push a vaccine to be developed really soon. There are other things on the priority list.
So, Holden, you've chosen this story because, it is an effect of the pandemic that we're seeing this kind of vaccine development, and maybe that's something we'll see across other diseases too.
Yeah, that's right. There is an irony here in that the plague vaccine comes from the Oxford Vaccine Group, which are the same people who are behind the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine for coronavirus, and it actually uses the same underlying technology to carry the particle of, in one case, coronavirus and in the other case, plague, that is hoped to prime the immune system. It's a very new vaccine technology. As Suchandrika said, we've also seen the brand new mRNA technologies, which is used to develop vaccines very quickly based on genetic profiling. And that was entirely theoretical up until the clinical trials proved that it worked at the end of last year. I remember researching articles about this time last year, which would list all of the sort of potential theoretical benefits of mRNA vaccines. And then you'd come to a sentence, inevitably somewhere near the end, which would say, of course, the drawback is this technology has never actually been shown to work in practice. And it was just a matter of months after that they were being used, they were saving lives. And so I think, amid a pandemic which doesn't have very many positives to draw out of it, it is worth spending a little bit of time looking at what we have learned and how that could benefit us in the future.
Yeah, I mean, again, Felicity, to return to your day job, you're all about trying to find positive spins on the big news stories, aren't you, very often? And this is a good news story to come out of the pandemic. It's one to add to, I imagine, quite a narrow pantheon. Yeah,
I agree. I think it is a positive. I think anything that puts more emphasis and interest and funding into curing other disease and helping other people is obviously music to my ears from a professional point of view, but also just a sort of, it's a good news story. I mean, that is a very real upside, but I think there have been downsides. I mean, I'm sort of still cynical about, the fact that with the COVID vaccine, the inequality of the people around the world who have got it has just been such a sort of huge, vast gulf. In Africa, they've said that less than 2% of the continent's population has received the first dose, and there's so much more to do just with COVID that the idea of sort of turning your attention to other parts of the world and really remote places like Madagascar and focusing on Black Plague, it would be amazing, but I'm sort of like not holding my breath, I suppose. And I suppose the other thing is that when you look at other diseases that are raging around the world, the COVID pandemic actually has disrupted prevention and treatment of quite a few of them.
So like what, like Ebola or?
Yeah, I mean, as countries went into lockdown, I think there were mass vaccination programs for measles, polio, meningitis. I'm sure there were others that sort of ground to a halt. I think in parts of the world, TB actually became much worse under lockdown with people in very close proximity. It means that, millions of children are at risk of deadly preventable diseases, and the sort of treatment for them has stopped, and health facilities have closed. Healthcare workers have been redeployed to fight COVID, essential medicines and devices have been delayed. So there is still quite an ugly and real downside to the lockdowns that have come in as a result of this pandemic that will have a knock-on effect to how we treat other diseases.
Yeah. I mean, Suchandrika, do you think it's kind of a distraction as well? It's difficult, isn't it? Because obviously if you're the scientists, working at a world-class vaccine facility, you're going to develop new vaccines and you'll be very proud of the work that you've done. But at what point do we stop vaccinating people against diseases that aren't a big threat and focus on the ones that are?
So yeah, that's a really huge calculation to make. At what point do we take the seriousness of a disease add to it how many people might be affected, and then say, should we put money and funding and time into making a vaccine? And I was just looking at an article from the British Medical Journal, and it's quite political how they look at the possible kind of outcomes of COVID-19 and the development of the vaccine. So they quote a German physician, writer and politician, Rudolf Virchow, who laid the foundation for public health in Germany. And he said medicine is a social science and politics is nothing else but medicine on a large scale. And the BMJ says that the genuine positive effects of COVID-19 will only come around when we acknowledge the centrality of wealth redistribution, public provision and social protection, and all of these other things which are quite kind of left-wing and political. And I'm guessing from their words that you really need the political will and the kind of social cohesion to help these scientists get the vaccine out there, if they even get round to even making it. So without society at large and political will, it doesn't really happen, does it?
So, Holden, if you could now put your well-sanitised hands onto your crystal ball, do you foresee ever more vaccines being developed? Do you see this one getting traction? Or is it a good news story that comes out in August that people will forget about?
I think, well, first of all, it's in the very first stage of clinical trials. So for this particular vaccine, we still need to see that it's effective and safe. If it is, I think there's possibly more of a chance that this will reach the places it needs to, partly just because there isn't the competition from the rest of the world. There isn't going to be huge demand in Europe for bubonic plague vaccines because it isn't so much of it isn't really a threat here at all. So I think there is a chance that this can reach the places. I do think there is possibly more urgency than it seems to get it to those places sooner, because there is the really big fear is that a drug-resistant form of the plague could take hold. There's antibiotic resistance is a well-established threat. And there have been isolated cases of antibiotic-resistant plague as well. And so I think if you started to see that take hold in places, that sense of urgency could mount very quickly, and perhaps supplies could start to be stockpiled in richer parts of the world. So yeah, I think this is a story with potentially very large consequences. It's almost in our interests to hope that the consequences remain small and localized rather than global and generalized.
Yeah, and that understanding, Felicity, is another thing that's happened as a result of our current circumstances, isn't it? If we were sitting here 18 months ago, we'd have been talking about a strange illness in a town we never heard of in China, and it probably won't come over here and we shouldn't worry about it, but isn't it interesting?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, but I mean, possibly to a fault. You can possibly say that we've gone too far and sort of gone into a state of hysteria and fear that doesn't always bode well for humans, and stops you from making rational and effective decisions. But certainly I still remember sitting in a cafe in Porto in Portugal, and the first cases were coming onto a TV that they'd arrived in Portugal, and that's just so arrogant and complacent. Like, this is never gonna hit the UK, and look where we are now. So yeah, I think that's true that COVID has definitely sort of changed our global outlook of how we think about diseases and how something seemingly small can turn very nasty very quickly.
There we are. An editor on the record admitting she is capable sometimes of making irrational decisions.
Sometimes.
Okay, Felicity. You're up next after this. Okay, Felicity, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
There's something bugging American diplomats this week.
It begins about 3 years ago. Strange sounds, almost unbearable.
We're all complaining of hearing a loud noise and or feeling pressure.
CBC News has learned a sonic attack in Cuba last year.
The mysterious syndrome makes headline news.
Explanations ranged from a high-tech attack by a nefarious government
tells the New York Times the main culprit
Theories
is likely
fly.
some kind of microwave
The
weapon.
FBI is now investigating whether these American
mass hysteria. There have been sonic wave attacks, microwave attacks.
God, this really isn't an episode for hypochondriacs this week, is it? Clips there from CBC's investigative documentary series, The Fifth Estate. Right, Felicity, first of all, what is Havana syndrome? Because you hadn't heard that the plague was still a thing. I'd never heard of Havana syndrome.
Yeah, I'm completely clueless on all these stories. Well, it's a very good question. I'm not sure anyone knows for sure what Havana syndrome is. It's a mysterious illness that's been afflicting American and Canadian diplomats and spies and embassy staff at various different locations over the world. So around 200 people, and the sort of first cases go back to about 2016. And it's called Havana syndrome because it was US diplomats in Havana who were sort of coming down with these very, very weird symptoms. They had pressure in their heads and the kind of sound of like swarming insects. They were suffering from nausea, fatigue. They couldn't remember things very well. They had ear pain, hearing loss. And later, when brain scans were carried out on them, there was tissue damage.
Wow.
That was similar to as if they'd been in a car accident or a bomb blast, but there hadn't been a physical impact. And this has led to some doctors referring to it as an immaculate concussion.
Okay, so what happened this week?
So this week, Kamala Harris, America's vice president, who is now in Vietnam, or was, I think she's still there, she delayed her, it's quite a minor thing, but she delayed her flight to Vietnam because of suspected cases of Havana syndrome in Hanoi, the country's capital. It's not quite clear who was actually affected by this, but they were worried enough by incidents there that they decided to postpone her travelling. They eventually decided it was safe, and so she went there. But it seems overall that these cases are adding up, and it certainly spooked sort of American intelligence agencies. And of course, the fingers are wagging, and there's lots of theories about what it is, but lots of people are pointing the finger to Moscow.
Yeah, so Suchandrika, in the clip there, we heard someone mention theories are flying. So Moscow's one theory. What are the top theories?
Okay, it's conspiracy time. So what Felicity mentioned about the tissue damage is really worrying because all the other symptoms you can ascribe to mass psychogenic illness, which is the extreme stress maybe of living under round-the-clock surveillance in Cuba and living, with a regime that possibly doesn't want you there. So it could be something that is happening sort of within the brain and in a response to something like that. But these brain scans seem really worrying to have that kind of tissue damage. It's not seen in every case, the tissue damage, so it could be due to other things. It's not happening all the time. But the American National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine had a report in 2020 showing that these issues have been taken more seriously, and they said that microwave beams could alter brain function without causing gross structural damage. So in fact, you don't need the tissue damage to actually suggest that something really bad has happened and it could have long-term effects on people. So in The Guardian, a kind of case study from May this year, it was a retired National Security Agency counterintelligence officer called Mike Beck, and he'd retired in late 2016. He's kind of one of those early patients whose symptoms weren't taken very seriously. He now has a rare early onset non-tremor form of Parkinson's, and he's kind of got the evidence supplied by the NSA and the CIA saying it could be because he was the victim of a deliberate attack. So he had all these symptoms mentioned with the kind of insect sounds, the kind of sense of pressure and so on. And he's become one of the kind of people saying, look, please believe us. It does seem to be the case that this could affect us in the future and affect our health. Could you please listen to us?
I mean, this is one of those weeks where I wish we had Alok here, but I've got you, Holden. From what you've read...
The poor man's Alok.
How likely does it seem that a microwave beam... It seems almost ridiculous to be saying this. It's like James Bond stuff, isn't it? But how likely does it seem to you that a microwave beam targeted at the head of one of your enemies could cause these kind of long-term effects?
From what I've read, there's different schools of thought, and I think the current prime theory is that it probably isn't microwaves because it would be hard to target them directly at the victim's brain. The theory of choice at the moment seems to be some sort of radio frequency attack, which is different in crucial ways from microwaves. And I think the idea is that it may not be sonic as such, but it's frequencies that can enter through the ear and so can target the inner ear in a particular way and cause this damage in the brain. It has to be said that there's no real hard evidence for this. This is sort of informed speculation rather than something that is being stated definitively. And there are still people who believe it is partly or mainly psychosomatic. That has receded as a theory since the evidence of these physical brain injuries have been seen, but it hasn't been completely accepted by everyone. And still in Cuba, the Cuban government is advancing the theory that it is actually crickets. They've suggested that it's the Jamaican field cricket can cause this sort of debilitating effect just through the noise of its mating call. Although the fact that these incidents have started to be noted throughout Europe as well perhaps undermines that particular theory.
The thing is, Felicity, even if there is this sort of solid nucleus of original cases that appear to be legit, it doesn't dismiss the psychological element of the theory in terms of mass hysteria causing other people to think they've had it, even if they haven't.
I just don't buy it at all. I know it sounds far-fetched and like something out of James Bond, and I'm sure if you've had these symptoms, you must think you're going mad. But when you start reading into people's experience of it, it's real and it's terrifying. And I just don't, obviously I'm sure there is an element of collective anxiety and paranoia that goes with it once you've heard about it. And I'm sure it's
right,
especially when it's Russia and Cuba involved, that it's very easy to put politics before like hard evidence and science and start imagining things. But I just don't buy it. There is definitely something going on here, which at the very least demands more of an investigation. And also, potentially we're talking about Russia, and it's just not unheard of. When you think about Russia and the attacks that they have perpetrated on foreign soil, this is not an unreasonable accusation to make. I was going through, there are obviously the well-known famous attacks that we all know, but I was reading as well about American officials and diplomats in St. Petersburg who were slipped date rape drugs last year. The US State Department has expressed on many times they're extremely concerned about how the Russian government treats American officials. There's really kind of like Stasi-esque stuff going on. Western officials finding signs that intruders have entered their homes. During Obama's first term, Russian agents reportedly broke in and killed the dog of a US defense official in Moscow. There's stories about furniture being rearranged, nocturnal break-ins. To me, it seems quite plausible. And I think it's a bit weird to just say it's just a bunch of insects, or it's just everyone getting a bit paranoid and hysterical.
Well, no, but if you're talking about the vice president, which is the innuendo here, isn't it, that it might have been her that actually felt the effects of this, although the White House haven't confirmed or denied that, you do think there's a lot going on in her head. She's about to travel to Vietnam. Of all weeks, do you really want the word Vietnam associated with you if you're the US vice president? And knowing that, if you get a headache, you would be a bit panicky. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying the original cases weren't true.
There are headaches and then there are headaches. And that's what they want you to believe. They want you to think you've just got a headache.
Yes. Suchandrika, that's the kind of, one hesitates to say brilliant, but that is the clever part of this as a piece of terrorism, if that's what it is, isn't it? Because the net result is people, ambassadors and stuff, don't want to bring their families to problematic countries or countries that have a difficult relationship with the US because they think, well, I'll have a headache, but I don't want my kids to get some awful, inalterable brain disease. And that does affect diplomacy.
Yeah, the way they're going about this, it's like gaslighting, isn't it? Like, we can't agree on what it is they're actually doing, and none of the experts can say, right, there's consistent kind of symptoms across all of the cases. But just going back to some of the reports that have been coming out about this, they are taking it more seriously. And this 2020 report from the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine in the US, they said that Russia has worked with microwave technology since the 50s. And the Soviet Union used to blast them at the American embassy in Moscow, which seems like quite a major allegation. And quite like, it feels like a 1970s paranoid thriller. I can't believe there isn't a film about this already if it's been going on since the 50s. But even though it seems really far-fetched and really strange, it does seem like they're taking it more seriously. They have sort of said, right, there are people around Kamala Harris who've been suffering this. Let's keep the vice president safe. So at least they are taking it more seriously, even though right now it feels like we don't have that much proof or that much evidence. And what we do have feels really far-fetched.
But again, Holden, in the absence of Alok, are there not scientific innovations that can guard against radio waves and microwaves? As Suchandrika says, we have had this technology for a long time. Surely you can just line the walls with something, no?
I think this is one of the really puzzling things about it, is that the embassies in, particularly in places like Moscow or Havana, places where people know they're going to be the subject of at least attempts to listen in. you would have thought they would be well protected. Some of these incidents have actually happened at the private homes of people who've been working in the embassies, who perhaps they don't have quite the same level of protection. But others have affected staff who've been working in official government buildings. One theory is actually that this began as an attempt to extract information. So perhaps the injuries were an unintended side effect of an attempt to surveil people, to extract information from smartphones, from laptops. And perhaps when the reports started to emerge, it then began to be used more as an offensive weapon, because it does seem to have started in quite a concentrated way in Havana, and only a year or so later began to crop up at other embassies, other premises around the world.
Felicity, do you see this as terminology, Havana syndrome, that we're all going to know in a year's time? It won't need explaining.
Yeah, I think so. I think it was definitely a story that was vaguely on my radar that I'd heard of and hadn't really looked into. And I just think it's going to get bigger and bigger, and you're going to hear more about it. And I just hope that that's because investigations are launched and that we find out more about what's going on.
Okay, well, for those of us who are feeling a little bit queasy, I'm pleased to say Suchandrika's story is nothing to do with health, or not illness anyway, and that's coming up after this. Okay, Suchandrika, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Just another meat-free Monday, or could it change the rest of your life?
Perhaps it's time to ask ourselves the question, what can I as an individual do to help? Well, there's a simple but significant way to help protect the planet and all its inhabitants. And it starts with just 1 day a week. 1 day without eating animal products can have a huge impact in helping maintain that delicate balance that sustains us all.
Almost a third of all land on Earth is used for livestock production.
Just try a day. Just 1 day.
A third of all cereal crops and more than 95% of soy is turned into feed for farmed animals.
1 day a week can make a world of difference.
Various famous voices from the Meat Free Monday campaign led by Sir Paul McCartney there. Right, Suchandrika, it is bank holiday weekend. I do have a packet of sausages defrosting as we speak. What are you about to tell me?
Oh, I'm sorry, Ollie. Are they vegetarian sausages? So, Meat Free Monday has been going for quite a few years, but we've just had a study come out, which has been conducted by Meat Free Monday and the Brighton and Sussex Medical School, which has found that 1 in 3 meat eaters who took part in Meat Free Monday for 5 years stopped eating meat completely. And that seems to me quite a big proportion, right? 1 out of 3 people.
I guess. I mean, there's a couple of things to bear in mind there, isn't there? One is the study was from Meat Free Monday, wasn't it? So they're hardly going to publish one where the results didn't say that. And the other is you'd say you've got to be at least sort of veggie curious, haven't you, if you take up this offer of committing to give up meat 1 day a week?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's this idea of flexitarianism, which I probably would term myself. And I think it's a good thing, and it's a good behaviour to look at, because psychologically, if you don't see that there's sort of a firm line between meat eating and vegetarianism and also veganism, but if you see yourself as someone who's willing to have a meat-free day or to give up certain things for health and for the planet, then I think those are good behaviours and they should be encouraged. So Paul McCartney, who's one of the founders of Meat Free Monday, he says if people skipped meat products for 1 day a week, if every person in Great Britain did that, it would reduce our carbon footprint by more than if every car was taken off the road for a whole day. So that feels like something that's within our control, because climate change can often feel like it is runaway and it's terrifying and it's much bigger than us. So this does feel like something we can do.
Can you just outline for us how, Suchandrika? Because that's such a bold claim, isn't it? You know, that if everyone gave up meat for a day, it would be the same as taking off every car from the road. How? How does the animal agriculture industry create that much carbon?
So it's worth looking at beef, for instance. So beef is the single most emissions-heavy food on the planet. And so beef is farmed all over the world and beef is flown all over the world. And so the cows who are farmed for the beef, they themselves create emissions in terms of having to have rainforests cleared for them to have space to therefore eat and live. And then once they are slaughtered, the animal products are then flown across the world, and that also adds to the emissions. So giving up beef for 1 day a week could have a larger impact than giving up other types of meat, and it could be worth trying to see if that has a positive effect on what's going on around us.
I suppose that depends, though, Holden, doesn't it, on what vegetables you eat as a substitute? Because, to think back to Meghan Markle's avocado controversy, there are eco-concerns with all kinds of fruit and veg that are much beloved of vegans and vegetarians as well.
Yeah, there's so many variables that go into agriculture and to all of the decisions really that we make in terms of, if we're trying to reduce emissions, if we're trying to reduce our impact on the earth in various different ways. It can seem overwhelming, and it's very easy to get bogged down in the detail. And I think one of the successful things really about Meat Free Mondays is it does try and simplify that and take a broader average approach. And on average, a vegetarian diet is less impactful on the environment in a lot of different ways, including carbon emissions, than a diet that's heavy in meat. And by making it a simple step, an achievable goal, it feels like it's something that can help to just push people in the right direction. And then if a reasonably large proportion of those people go on to make a full switch, then that's going to have a beneficial effect.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's very much targeted, this, isn't it, Felicity, at the kind of people who still see Paul McCartney as a major cultural figure. I mean, it's targeted basically at the West, isn't it, where you go to your supermarket to get your vegetables and your meat. I mean, if you're a goat farmer slaughtering your own goat, that isn't environmentally more problematic than going to the supermarket and buying a pineapple.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It's a very sort of Western thing, isn't it? And it's very sort of preachy Hollywood celebrities telling us how to live our lives, and some people that really works for them, and other people, I think it will put them off for a long time. And yeah, I mean, it just doesn't work. You can't go around telling people in various parts of the world that they should give up meat because they have different diets and different ecosystems. And, some people who eat meat in the world will be among the most environmentally friendly. And, I think a lot of the time with the whole meat debate, it's actually more to do with sort of how we raise our livestock and the sort of intensive farming. I imagine if we all had a pig in our backyard who was a really good recycler. I think they're talked about as sort of upcyclers, aren't they? Animals, because they eat this grass, which to us is sort of has no nutritional benefit, and they turn it into meat, which is actually very, very good for humans. And I think it's more to do with how we raise animals and our sort of intense over eating of them. I'm not actually sure that eating meat in and of itself is bad for the environment. And I suppose the other thing is that it slightly irks me when it kind of feels as though it's pushing the responsibility onto individuals. It's the same with recycling. And actually, I imagine the focus has got to be on the fossil fuel companies. And it's just so convenient to say, give up meat on Monday and recycle your plastics and we can save the world, when that's just absolute nonsense. It's the huge companies and seismic changes that need to come into force if we're going to stand a chance of solving this thing. But the other thing is that I do think it's very interesting from a sort of human behaviour point of view that it's just so effective. You're asked to give up meat one day a week. People have obviously really got behind it. And when you compare it to the Extinction Rebellion protests this week, for example, you can just see that it's so divisive, it's so polarising. So many arrests have been made, so many people hate the disruption, and it's just so interesting to think about the climate crisis, what is going to be the best thing to do to sort of spur people into action, and what's going to be the thing that really puts people off.
And also, Suchandrika, whether the McCartneys are using the climate crisis as a bit of a Trojan horse, really, because Paul McCartney's been at this for 50 years, that the reason he's vegetarian is he doesn't believe in animal cruelty, which is a perfectly ethically, morally defensible position. Is this sort of acknowledgement, really, that argument has not been lost, but been exhausted? Like saying it's bad to kill animals because it hurts them obviously isn't reaching Gen Z and millennials in the same way as saying save the planet.
Oh, yeah, it's really interesting. I would probably argue that it's a slightly older demographic. If this is looking at over 5 years, I think it's probably people late 20s, 30s, 40s probably. And I agree with you that probably the animal cruelty side of things doesn't always hit home with everyone. I'd say there's the climate change side, but also hugely the health side of things. And more than that, I mean, convenience is so much a part of our diets. And the fact that meat substitutes have really improved, and the conversation around like non-dairy products. So I bought oat milk for the first time in my Tesco shop the other week, just because the idea of cow's milk has started to make me feel a bit like, ugh. And also we have less lactase in our systems, the enzyme that processes lactose, which is in cow's milk, as we age. So infants have a lot of lactase to help them processed milk, but we lose that as we get older, and also some people are allergic. So I thought, let's try it. I've heard it's really good. Had it with some banana Nesquik because I'm living my best life at the moment, and it was really nice. And I also tried like vegan desserts, and I feel like they've done that quite well. And so for me, over the last 5 years, I haven't done meat-free Monday, I will say that. But I would say that it's the conversation around meat substitutes and non-dairy products that made me get quite interested in like what my friends are eating if they're going veggie or vegan. How could I try that? Would it be good for my health? Is it good for the environment? It's kind of a whole package that has got me interested. It's awareness more than anything.
I must say, I started eating Beyond Burger as part of a taste test on one of my other podcasts, The Modern Man, as a trend, just to see what it was like. And as it turns out, Beyond Burger does taste almost exactly the same as beef, and I now eat it instead of beef burgers. So it is literally because the product's better. I mean, that's the only reason that I've switched. God knows what's in it.
Oh, so you found a good beef alternative? Because I've not tried a good beef alternative. I find that chicken is done quite well by meat substitutes, and like mince for like chili con carne and that kind of thing. I was making bolognese and chili con carne on lockdown, and I thought instead of like fatty mince and having to deal with the raw meat, just get the corn equipped because it's the same. But that's interesting that you like the beef one. I might try that. So it's tips like that, it's word of mouth like that makes me go, oh, maybe I'll try that.
Well, I went to a vegetarian boarding school, so therefore had no choice but to be vegetarian for most of my childhood. And so I can speak from bitter experience that in the 90s, all the meat substitutes were appalling. The menu was much better when they just admitted that you could just have a baked potato with cheese and that was fine. When they tried to do a vegetarian sausage. Whereas now, Holden, they're much better, aren't they?
Well, I think that gets to the heart of this division between the sort of meat-free Monday approach and the Extinction Rebellion approach, which is that, I think the part of what Extinction Rebellion is about making really big fundamental changes, and the fact that those changes are really difficult is almost part of the point. Like, it's meant to be a challenge. It's meant to be throwing away everything we have at the moment and rebuilding society on completely different foundations. There was a report that came out coincidentally this week from the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, which was very much in line with the Meat-Free Mondays approach, and really suggesting that the changes we need to make to meet international emissions targets are more modest and more achievable than it sometimes seems. And in fact, they say that if, on average, we reduce meat intake by 20% per person, that would bring down agricultural emissions to the limits recommended by the International Panel on Climate Change.
There you are, Felicity. It's not nonsense. The former Prime Minister says so.
I don't buy it.
But I think, those changes were meant to be part of a broader change, including reducing miles travelled by car by, I think, 4%, switching 60% of cars to electric power within the next 10 to 15 years. But the whole point of the report was really to break it down into these step-by-step incremental changes year by year, and trying to say that look, we don't have to throw everything away, that electric cars are going to be better than petrol cars, that vegetarian food can be better than meat-based food, that we don't have to make too many sacrifices to make this change. And I think the theory behind that is that that's a much more palatable version and a more achievable version, and it avoids some of the issues of sort of climate anxiety that we were talking about on the podcast a few weeks ago, where you just get that sense of the sort of overwhelming threat that we can't really do anything about.
I mean, Felicity, you're our voice of the Ute. Do you think that there's a stigma, or there could be in the near future, a stigma to eating meat, like there probably is for a lot of the people that read your magazine, of driving big petrol, gas-guzzling cars?
Yeah, I think so. I think we're already seeing it. I mean, interestingly, on the magazine, we had a recipe for some salmon fish cakes the other week, and we had some complaints.
I love hearing about the controversies that come from the most unlikely of places. Go on, yeah.
My inbox lit up. With complaints about promoting fish in the magazine. I mean, not that many, to be fair, but something that I thought was sort of entirely innocent and quite healthy. Someone had said, our fish stocks are being wiped out, and it's not responsible for you to be promoting this recipe. I mean, to be fair, when we do recipes, most of them are vegetarian because they're just easy and quick and cheap. And we rarely do meat ones, but I just thought it was an interesting sign of the times that even putting a fish recipe in was now a sort of controversial thing to do. And
20 years ago, it would have been, why are you only publishing vegetarian recipes? Where are my children supposed to get their sustenance from?
Yeah, and I mean, that's the thing. I'm sure we've got plenty of families and readers who are very happy eating meat in moderation and would like to continue doing that. So, you're trying to sort of appease everyone, really. But, I mean, certainly the climate anxiety, I think we feel palpably that our readers are very, very concerned about it. It's very close to their hearts, and that's heartbreaking, really. That's just very, very sad.
So, Suchandrika, do you think you're going to follow the participants in this study and go full-blown vegetarian within 4 years?
I'm not a very goal-orientated person, which is probably why I don't go around saying I'm veggie or vegan.
Can I use you to offset my meat consumption?
We'll have a deal.
I'll give you a goal. 2025.
You're loving the fake beef burgers. I think, Ollie, it's got you too.
I am all right. Yeah, I'm probably, I reckon I'm vegan 2 or 3 days a week.
Yeah, and that's super doable. And you learn new recipes and you learn new things. And also with kids as well. Like you mentioned in the 90s at school, your school's vegetarian, which is fascinating. And vegetarian food was not great in the 90s. In April 2019, all 80 primary schools in Edinburgh went meatless 1 day a week. And now that we have better substitutes and better messaging around it, it does feel like a positive thing to let children know, there's alternatives, you can opt out. But yeah, I will say that my grocery shop looks like a vegetarian person's shop more these days. But when I go out, I don't put any limitations on what I do. So who knows? I'll check back in with you in a couple of years, Ollie. We'll go for a fake beef burger.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to wrap that up now because I need to go and put those sausages in the fridge. That is it from Holden, Felicity and Suchandrika. Thanks to them. Remember, you can follow this show for free, not meat-free, just for free. Search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.